Is process costing, chapter 6, accounting 711. I'm your professor, George Smelsley. So I want to start a little bit by talking about just what process costing is. And basically, it's what we did with job order costing, same exact thing, except for now we're going to do a little bit different approach, uh, mainly because the products are all the same. So with job order costing, each product was different, and we had a job cost sheet that we use for each product that we built or each type of product that we built. We don't need to be as sophisticated with process costing. It's basically an averaging. So, if you look at this first slide, notice that both systems assign material, labor, and overhead costs to products. And that's basically your objective. You want to assign material, labor, and overhead costs to your product. We're going to use the same accounts: overhead, raw materials, work in process, basically the same journal entries. All right, so there's just a little bit different journal entries with process costing and job order costing, but for the most part, they are identical. So with process costing, as I mentioned, the most, I guess, important factor is that it's a homogeneous product. One product's produced on a continuing basis or for a longer period of time. Normally, it's going to go through more than one department. Um, the production cost sheet is a document that we use to accumulate costs in a process costing system. Unit cost will be computed by department. We'll only be using, well, I guess in your homework you have two departments. So when you have a second department, you're going to have transferred in costs from the previous department. We'll talk about how we handle those. It's very simple. All right, so here's just a quick check. So process costing is used for products that are similar and produced continuously. All right, where A, different and produced to continue, well, individual units produced for customer specification. C would be for job order costing. Different and produced continuously would probably, we would use operations costing for that type of environment. All right, so processing department would be like welding or painting or finishing. So any unit in the organization where we're adding material, labor, and overhead to the product. All right, so first we're going to look at how we record the flow of material, labor, and overhead through the process costing system. You're going to see that these charts are very similar to what we did in job order costing 2 weeks ago. So we start with direct material, labor, and overhead. Once we start working on the product, we say that the product now, the raw materials are now converted to work in process. All right, and then when the goods are completed, they're transferred to finished goods, and then finally they're sold. These journal entries that we did in job order costing will be identical in process costing, this part of it. So in other words, when materials are issued, we'll debit work in process and credit raw materials. When we use labor, we'll debit work in process and credit wages payable. When overhead is applied and we use predetermined overhead rates with process costing, we'll debit work in process and credit manufacturing overhead. So in a job ordering system, we trace the product to specific jobs. In a process costing system, we trace it to a processing department. If we have more than one processing department, you're going to have what's called transferred in costs. All right, and that's just simply the cost from a previous department, and they'll be treated the same way that you treat materials. All right, so let's look at some T accounts and journal entries in the process costing system. All right, and so we're going to assume that we have two departments. So I issue raw materials to Department A and to Department B. All right, so the journal entry would be debit work in process Department A, credit raw materials. And down below, debit work in process Department B and credit raw materials. So there's your journal entry. All right, and then very similar for wages, and it's really identical to what we did with job order costing. We have labor that's now being assigned to these two departments rather than a job. They're being assigned to the two departments. So I said they're identical. I guess the only difference is that we would say job, work in process, job number 150. Here with process costing, we say department. So here's the work in process for labor for Department A and Department B, and then we credit wages payable for the total. And then the same thing with overhead. Overhead is applied to work in process to these two departments. And we'll use a predetermined overhead rate. Same entry as before. We'll debit work in process for Department A and Department B and credit manufacturing overhead. All right, as I alluded to earlier, we may have transferred in costs. So we're done in Department A. We've got material, labor, and overhead costs. I'm going to transfer those to these costs from Department A. I'm going to transfer them to Department B. They are treated when accounting for these and looking at what we call equivalent units of production. We're going to talk about that in a minute. They are accounted for basically the same exact way as you would account for your direct materials. So just consider the transferred in costs as direct materials. All right, so when I make my entry for my transferred in costs, I'm going to debit work in process Department B and credit work in process Department A because the goods are no longer part of Department A, but now they are part of Department B. All right, Department B is my last department. The material, labor, overhead plus transferred in costs would equal my cost of goods manufactured for the period, and those would be transferred out to finished goods. So I debit finished goods and credit finished goods inventory and credit work in process Department B. All right, and then this is just like in job order costing. Once the goods are sold, I'll debit cost of goods sold and credit finished goods. All right, now let's look at equivalent units of production. In job costing, we didn't use this because we had different products, different types of products that were being made, and we had to account for each type of product individually. With process costing, we don't need to do this, so we can just average all the costs. So the problem is, if we started, let's say, on January 1st with 0 beginning work in process inventory, and on December 31st, 0 ending work in process inventory, equivalent units of production would just be number of units produced. Unfortunately, we're probably going to have some units that are partially complete at the beginning of the year and partially complete at the end of the year. Because of that, we can't just average the cost. We can't just divide by units produced because some of the units have not been completed or some of the units were started back in the previous period. So we're going to need to account for that by using what's called equivalent units of production. So all we're saying with equivalent units of production is that, let's say I have, let's use our example, I have 10,000 units that are 70% complete. That is equivalent to 7,000 completed units. So for the current period, Jones started 15,000 units and completed 10,000. There are 5,000 units in process that were 30% complete. What's the total equivalent units of production for the period? So the amount in ending inventory will be the 5,000 units times 30%. So 1,500 there. And I'd have to add that to the 10,000 that was started and completed during the period. So 11,500, or B, would be my equivalent units of production for the period. All right, so there are two methods. We're going to look at both of them. There's two methods of equivalent units of production. One is the weighted average method, and the second method would be the first in, first out method. So let's first look at the weighted average method. So with the weighted average method, we don't look at work done in, we examine the work done in prior periods, but we don't make any distinction that it's going to be computed. We basically average units from last period with units of this period. So we blend together costs and units from prior and current periods. All right, the equivalent units under weighted average, the calculation is simply the units transferred out plus the percentage of ending work in process that's complete. So it's a very simple calculation for EUP, for equivalent units of production. Let's talk a little bit about overhead, because the equivalent units of production we'll be using for material, labor, and overhead. But we're going to see in your book and in your problems that we take labor and overhead, make it one amount, we'll call it conversion cost. So we'll have direct materials and we'll have conversion costs as our two product costs instead of having three. Instead of having material, labor, and overhead, we'll just have material and conversion. One reason why they do this is that the direct labor costs in a process costing environment, because it might be a very highly automated environment, that direct labor cost might be quite small when compared to overhead, so we'll just fold it together with the overhead costs and say, hey, cost to convert raw materials to work in process, we're just going to call that conversion costs. All right, so that's what they're showing here. All right, here's an example of the weighted average approach. So I've got 300 units in beginning work in process, 6,000 units started, 5,400 units transferred out, 900 units in ending work in process. All right, well, guess what? You can just ignore these first two. You're just interested in these last two down here. How many units are transferred out, and what's the percentage of ending work in process? So for both material and conversion, and by the way, I'm going to have two different equivalent units for materials and conversion, because materials typically are added kind of discreetly, might all be added at the beginning of the process, or half at the beginning and half at 50%, where conversion is normally added uniformly. All right, so we've got 30% of the labor and overhead has been completed, 60% of the materials are there. All right, so I got 5,400, and then for materials, I'll add 900 times 60%, which is what, 540. And for conversion, I'll take 900 times 30%, which is 270. All right, so units completed and transferred, plus the ending work in process, 540 for materials at 900 units times 60%, and then for conversion, 900 times 30%, or 270. So there's my equivalent units of production for materials and for conversion. So just going back to the original data, ignore the first two lines. We're going to need these first two lines when we do first in, first out. So we can't ignore it forever, but for weighted average you can. So it's just your units completed and transferred out plus the percentage of ending work in process that was completed during the period. And there you have your equivalent units of production in June for material and for conversion. All right, so just as a review, it always equals your units transferred out plus the equivalent units remaining in ending work in process. Okay, so this just shows you a diagram of what we just looked at. So I had beginning units of 300 units and 5,100 units started and completed. I blend those together, so I use that 5,400 of units transferred in my calculation, and then I added to that my percentage of units that were complete in ending work in process. All right, and this was for materials, and this one's for conversion. All right, now we've gotten our equivalent units for the two, for material and for conversion, 5,940 and 5,670. These are my two calculations for EUP, for material, and for conversion. What I want to do now is compute the cost per equivalent unit. All right, so I'm just going to divide. I'm just going to divide materials, raw material costs by equivalent units of production for materials, and conversion costs by equivalent units of production for conversion. So let's take a look at how that works. All right, so the cost per equivalent unit is going to be my cost of beginning WIP. Remember, we blend them together, plus the cost of units added during the period and divide by the equivalent units of production. So in effect, we're using some costs from the previous period when computing your EUP. That's a criticism of it, that in that unit cost figure, it is using costs from the previous period. Okay, so my total cost to account for my beginning work in process for materials were $61.19, just given up here in this problem. And for conversion, $39.20. And I'm going to add that to the cost I added for material. So the 118,621 was the material requisitions that I had for this period. 81,130 would be my labor and overhead costs for this period. I'm going to add those to the beginning WIPs for each of those. So I have 124,740 total cost for materials and 85,050 total cost for conversion. I'm going to divide by my equivalent units of production, and I have a cost per unit of $21 for materials and $15 for conversion. All right, so you only hope it'll round out that nicely for you on your homework and exam questions. All right, now I've got the cost per unit, and I simply need to use these cost per units in assigning these costs to the units transferred out and to the units in ending work in process. All right, so let's look at the ending work in process first. I had 540 units in ending work in process for materials and 270 for conversion. I'm going to multiply that by the cost per equivalent unit, $21, just computed for materials, and $15 for conversion. And so my cost of ending work in process is $11,340 for materials and $4,050 for conversion. All right, and then units transferred out. Cost of units transferred out. Remember, we had 5,400 units that were transferred out. All right, and I need to multiply that times the cost per unit, which is $21 for materials and $15 for conversion. All right, so there's cost of units transferred out, 113,400 for materials and 81,000 for conversion, so a total of 194,400. Now we're going to make a journal entry because these are transferred out to finished goods, so we'll make a journal entry for the 194,400. The 15,390 is still in work in process. No journal entry is needed yet because those goods have not been completed. We've already made journal entries to account for the work in process. We're not going to make a journal entry for finished goods here because the goods are not completed. We'll only make a journal entry for the finished goods for the 194,400. So I'll debit finished goods. You can read that for 194,400 and credit work in process for 194,400. All right. Another approach other than job order and process costing is operations costing, which is a hybrid of both job order and process. It has the material part of job order costing, but it applies labor and overhead the same way we do in process costing with equivalent units. All right, now we're going to look at FIFO method of equivalent units of production. So we're going to do the same thing we did before, except for we're just going to compute the equivalent units a little bit differently. But then we'll do the same approach we did before. We'll cost the ending work in process. We'll cost the units transferred out to finished goods. We'll make a journal entry to finished goods. So we're going to do the same process. Find equivalent units. Find cost per unit. Find the amount of costs for units transferred out under FIFO. Find the cost of ending work in process under FIFO, and then make a journal entry for the amount of goods that are transferred out to finished goods. All right, so FIFO method is considerably more accurate. We're not blending this period's units and costs with last period's units and costs. So we're just using current costs. When computing your unit cost figure, you're just using current costs from this period. You'll see what I mean in a minute, but just using current costs, just those costs that were worked on or that were expended this period. So first, we're going to look at the FIFO equivalent units calculation. All right, so I have same information as before. I have 300 units in work in process, 40% complete this period, and I'm sorry, 40% was complete from the previous period, 20%. So we got here January 1st, midnight, 40% of the materials are there and 20% of the conversion costs are there with respect to beginning WIP. We started 6,000 units. We completed and transferred out 5,400. And then we have ending work in process of 900. So an important calculation here is to find units started and finished during the period. So if I started 6,000 and I completed 5,400, but 300 of those were from beginning WIP. My started and completed would be 5,100, the units completed, and transferred out 5,400 minus 300 units that were started. So we had 5,400 units, transferred to finished goods. However, 300 of those were from beginning WIP. So 5,100 would be units started and finished for the period. All right, and the other thing is, and I just showed you that slide, when computing the equivalent units under FIFO, we only look at what we worked on this period. So the 40% and 20% we're not going to use, but we will use the other 60%. So in other words, I did 60% of this work this period, so I've got 180 I have to account for materials, and for conversion, 80% of the work I did this period, so 80% times 300 is 240. So the 180 and the 240 would be relevant in computing your equivalent units, right? The 180, so subtract out that 40% that was done last period. We did 60% this period of that 300 units to finish them up. So I got 180 for materials, and then 80% for conversion. We did 80% of the work in this period, so I have 240 for conversion related to beginning WIP. All right, then I mentioned earlier units started and completed were 5,100 because I completed 5,400, but 300 of those were in beginning WIP, so only 5,100 were started and completed this period. And the third piece that we need, of course, is the ending WIP, which is the same calculation as before. 900 units in ending WIP, 60% complete with respect to materials, and 30% complete with respect to conversion. All right, so just showing the same slide as before, right? We had 5,400 units transferred out, but only 5,100 started and completed because 300 were in beginning WIP, and then we had 900 units in ending WIP. So 6,000 total units to account for. And then under FIFO would be 5820. 5820 would be my equivalent units for materials, and because we got 120 in my this is just a reconciliation. Let's show this one here. The equivalent units are 5820 for FIFO for materials and 5610 for conversion. All right, and these are the diagrams that show you what was done this period and last period. Now this is just showing a difference between FIFO that we can reconcile between the two. The difference is in the amount in that beginning inventory that was accounted for. Under weighted average, we included it. Under FIFO, we do not include the beginning WIP work done the previous period. All right, compute the cost per equivalent unit then using FIFO. So again, here's our costs, and I've got beginning work in process cost of $61.19 and $39.20 from last period. All right, and then we added $118.621. This includes costs added to the beginning WIP and the $81 130. So we're just going to use those current costs. We're not going to use these costs from the previous period. We're not going to use the 6119 and 3920 when computing the cost per unit. We're just going to use the 118,621 and 81,130. All right, so for materials, 118,621. Remember, we had a 5820 equivalent unit. So we don't get a good rounding number here. $20.38 approximately, and $14.46 approximately for conversion. All right, and then total cost. So management might be interested in this, right? $34.84 to be the total cost of goods transferred out. I'm sorry, total unit cost. We'll use that. $34.84 to compute the cost of goods transferred out. So we're going to assign the costs. All right. So first, for my beginning WIP, I had 540 equivalent units, and I'm sorry, for ending WIP, excuse me, I had 540 equivalent units and 270 for conversion, 540 for material, 270 for conversion. We computed those earlier, 900 times 60%, so that was what was done this period for ending WIP, and 30%. We didn't get it done. We only got 60% of the materials in and 30% of the conversion in. All right, and then we had a cost per equivalent unit for each of 20.38 and 14.46 for conversion. So approximately 14,911 would be my ending WIP. And remember, no journal entry for this. Entries have already been made for this to account for work in process. So that's my ending work in process for the period, 14,911. All right. Now I want to look at the costs transferred out. So first of all, I have this beginning work in process cost. I have to account for that. We didn't account for it in our unit cost, but we still need to account for it when computing the cost of the product. All right, because these costs are part of the product. They were incomplete beginning work in process at the beginning of the period. These were the costs from last period. We will include those when computing the total cost. We don't compute those. We don't use those, as I mentioned, though. We don't use those as part of the calculation of unit cost. All right, so we add those, and then we had equivalent units to complete in beginning WIP of 180 and 240. We'll multiply those by the unit cost that we just computed of 20.38 and 14.46. So the total cost of beginning WIP at 10,039 from the previous period, plus the 7140 of current cost of material and conversion that we added this period. Then we're going to go ahead and look at the costs transferred out. Remember, we had 5,100 units transferred to finished goods. We'll multiply those by the cost per unit of $20.38 and $14.46. Total of $177,701 would be transferred out for the goods started and completed. The cost of the goods started and completed was $177,701. So total cost of goods transferred out for goods started and completed were $177,701. We have to add to that, of course, the $17,179 for beginning WIP. We're going to do that up here. So my total costs of units transferred out, goods started and completed, were $177,701, and then $17,179 for beginning WIP. Add those together and I got $194,880 is my cost transferred to finished goods for the period. All right, so I took you through FIFO and I took you through weighted average, and we just kind of, as a review, we completed equivalent units, we did unit costs, and then we assigned those costs to ending WIP and units transferred to finished goods. All right, so that's my lecture. Hope you have a great week. Sorry I got these up, the lecture up a little bit late, but the notes are up. So I will see you in the discussion board. You guys have a good week. Thanks.